And here it is. Oh, wait. Wrong map. There we go. To clarify, this is not a claim-by-claim debunking of a 3-minute-long video. As the title suggests, this video can be more accurately defined as a critique, because rather than disproving every claim basic logic and the video makes, it is to provide a more nuanced lens on the very simplified narrative he gives on the situation. I am not a historian, and this is not a historical video, and would not like it to be portrayed as such. This video gives history to provide context, not inherently say that these were the definitive facts. If you are to look into this particular period in history, I suggest instead of looking at his video or mine, I recommend you consume media produced by an individual who has the expertise and knowledge while doing your own research, putting time, effort, then digesting it in a thorough manner while also putting away your biases to look for a more nuanced and human truth rather than just practicality. This video is meant for an observational level of education. This is not a scholarly unraveling where I go through a multitude of documents, primary accounts, secondary accounts, because I have neither the time nor resources. But I would like to say this. Even with an abundance of information, it becomes useless if you use them to portray a one-sided point instead of correlating and combining with other sources or points that go against your argument. The way you use your information is different from the information that is at your disposal. This is not meant to be an attack on basic logic as a creator or even as a person. There is a reason why YouTube and many other social media platforms like it exist, so it can show the many perspectives others have in this world. Even sources or perspectives that we ourselves consider to be erroneous and or disingenuous should be taken into account rather than simply saying everything verbatim, then concluding with the statement that this is the objective truth. My video is a critique on his video, not a critique of his character or his other content. And to reiterate to those who have not picked up the clue yet, as said in the title, this is a critique on the Crusades Were Justified, so why are they slandered, and not a definitive debunking. To twist my words into saying that the existence of this video is an attack on basic logic, you have missed the point. I have no personal grudges against basic logic, his viewers, or his content. It is up to the audience how to interpret it, but this is my interpretation of this specific video, and this video alone. Our perception of reaction videos or critique/debunking videos has become extremely flawed over the course of these past few years, because some of them forget that you can be critical without being inflammatory or combative. A critique I am making here is not the Crusades were bad because the Crusaders were. That is a hasty generalization and shown through a perspective where we can gather bevies of information from not only just the Muslims and Islamic states, but also the perspectives of the Crusaders. And while primary accounts are important because of the fact that it was written by an individual who was there and was present, it does not mean it is incontrovertible. Rather, primary accounts can be typically shown through a lens that is slightly more subjective than objective. If a Frank soldier or a Seljuk nomad writes his story on how he saw the Crusades, that's not objective fact. That is an opinion of a person in history, not a historian. And it also does not mean that a secondary source that states the Crusades were justified when the main perspective is hyperfixated on the West's point of view is also indisputable. I am not putting this here because basic logic uses primary or secondary sources to back up his argument. Instead, he provides a minimum amount of facts and intentionally or unintentionally removes context from the situation. The only problem with this, however, is that the loss of detail continues to push his portrayal of the Crusades as a necessity and a practical event to save Western civilization. More importantly, I am not suggesting that the other side of the Crusades, the Islamic-ruled territories, were more just. This is a piece of sectarian history and violence that should not be given a very simplistic and what may assume to be a pragmatic answer, because history has no true or at least constant pragmatism. History happens because it does. There is no real way to provide logic when many things in history are, in of itself, illogical and made by human fallacies. Despite this, History is an insightful way to study how we act and how we truly are when met with circumstances like this. Basic Logic concluded the video that the Crusades were a total Christian victory, and even gave examples of the survival of Constantinople and the Reconquista. A problem with this, however, is that this is a result of survival, not total victory as he claims. If this was indeed total victory, then the Crusades would have had a much more lasting impact physically rather than religiously, as we see in Islamic literature, remarkably, Salafist jihadist and extremist literature or rhetoric. This is not fixated on the historical facts. Rather, this is a critique of the perspective Basic Logic shows and how his methodology starts losing ground when you understand the complexities of the era he discusses in a very brief manner without much context. What were the Crusades? To sum it up, spanning from the 11th to the 13th century, these were papal-condoned acts of what we may consider to be expeditions to arrive in battle against the Islamic-ruled lands, retake the Holy Land, and ensure a large boundary between West and East. These expeditions and attempts at liberation, from a tactical and political standpoint, did not achieve any goals of permanently liberating the Holy Land, nor did they defeat the Muslims on a wide scale. In fact, it cemented even more hatred or at least spite on both sides that would continue up until the present day. The reason as to why the concept of the Crusades even happened was a result of Seljuk Turks coming from Central Asia and into Persia, flowing through the Middle East, then into portions of the Caucasus, even pushing into already established Islamic-ruled territories before they closed in around Constantinople and were on the border with Byzantine. This caused the Byzantine emperor himself to write to Robert of Flanders, who would in turn relay Pope Urban II this message. This letter, whether by the Emperor Alexius Komnenos, Robert of Flanders, or a third party, was skewed and exaggerated in some aspects. Therefore, I cannot say this is the actual contents of the letter, but I will read a few excerpts from the letter that was released to the public. I recommend you to take this with a grain of salt, and should not consider that this was actually written word for word. O most illustrious Count and especial comforter of the Christian faith, I wish to make known to your prudence how the most sacred empire of the Greek Christians is being sorely distressed by the Pechenegs and the Turks, who daily ravage it and intermittently seize its territory, and there is promiscuous slaughter and indescribable killing and derision of the Christians. But since the evil things they do are many and, as we have said, indescribable, we will mention but a few of the many which nevertheless are horrible to hear and disturb even the air itself. For they circumcise the boys and youths of the Christians over the Christian baptismal fonts, and in contempt of Christ, they pour the blood from the circumcision into the said baptismal fonts, and compel them to void urine thereon, and thereafter they violently drag them around in the church, compelling them to blaspheme the name of the Holy Trinity and the belief therein. Noble matrons and their daughters whom they have robbed of their possessions, they, one after another like animals, defile in adultery. Some indeed in their corrupting shamelessly place virgins before the faces of their mothers, and compel them to sing wicked and obscene songs until they have finished their own wicked acts. Hasten therefore with your entire people and fight with all your strength, lest such treasure fall into the hands of the Turks and the Pechenegs, because, while they are infinite, just now 60,000 are daily expected, and I fear that by means of this treasure they will gradually seduce our covetous soldiers. Take into account how in this letter, Alexius Komnenos never mentions Saracens, pagans, or Arabs, any terms that would be used in the Crusades by the Crusaders as general terms for Muslim or non-Christian peoples, and singles out Pechenegs, who are semi-nomadic peoples who also belong underneath the Turks, and Turks. He never makes a claim about Muslims as a whole. Pope Urban II would later, in his own speech, possibly inspired by the letter by Komnenos to the Count of Flanders, say, "For, as the most of you have heard, the Turks and Arabs have attacked them and have conquered the territory of Romania, the Greek Empire, as far west as the shore of the Mediterranean and the Hellespont, which is called the Arm of St. George. They have occupied more and more of the lands of those Christians and have overcome them in 7 battles. They have killed and captured many, and have destroyed the churches and devastated the empire. If you permit them to continue thus for a while with impurity, the faithful of God will be much more widely attacked by them. On this account I, or rather the Lord, beseech you, as Christ's heralds, to publish this everywhere and to persuade all people of whatever rank, foot soldiers and knights, poor and rich, to carry aid promptly to those Christians and to destroy that vile race from the lands of our friends. One of basic logic's arguments is that the East, almost made up of entirely Muslim-majority states, was threatening the existence of the West, and therefore is one of his justifications as to why the Crusades had to be done. While there may have been a fear of being overpowered by what the West might have perceived to be a domineering and coherent force, this was not the case, as I will get into after this section. Despite the fact some consider Crusaders to be of one entity before the Crusades and even during the somewhat unification underneath Christianity, Western civilization itself was not largely coordinated. Basic logic did state that the Crusaders were transcontinental and had multiple language barriers, but never fully expanded as to why this mattered, only stating that this would be a logistical nightmare. Here's a quick rundown. They were made up of different ethnic groups, some of which fought one another, and is one of the reasons why the Northern Crusades were not against Muslims but Eastern European pagans in the Baltics, as well as Christian states later on. There were the Franks in Gaul and their former foes, Iberians who had been driven out after their lands were conquered, then Normans, descendants of Vikings in northern France, the English, Germanics, and finally the Italians. Among them were also mixed peoples that scattered throughout the region. One of the key states in the Crusades was the Holy Roman Empire and its influenced regions in what is modern-day Germany and northern Italy. The most western-eastern civilization was Byzantine within what is modern-day Greece and south-central parts of the Balkans to the edges of Anatolia, having the only physical remaining evidence of Rome, that is the city of Constantinople. Beyond Byzantine were Islamic-ruled lands. To the south were the predecessors and successors of the caliphates in the areas encompassing the Levant, Mesopotamia, Arabia, and all across the Sinai, North Africa, and up until the Iberian Peninsula. So, if we think about all of these factors compounding on top of one another, the most likely perception of the West, especially the papacy at that time, was they were surrounded on all sides by an enemy who were followers of a religion they had at least a basic knowledge of, yet without a full grasp of their culture, peoples, economies, and even how the Muslims must have perceived them. They must have seen this as a form of aggression. The question is now, what was the perception of the Muslims to the Westerners, and even Christians that were on their borders? Like many of the peoples in the Middle East, the Muslims were born from an extremely troubling or complex history shaped by the cradle of civilization. While the Islamic-ruled lands, as well as the predecessors and successors of the Caliphate, expanded across many territories without what we consider to be a legal justification, they focused more on expansion to connect with many of their diaspora descendants, while also in the process taking over lands that were indeed inhabited before their arrival. These people would be under their rule and would learn some information about who they were and what they did. One may say that this was a utopia, considering that they did not outright slaughter them, but that is a poor expectation. Yes, the Caliphate and many other Islamic states allowed non-Muslims to live. It did not mean that they were not unskeptical of one another or had no grudges against one another. Instead, this was a transactional way of life, which I will talk about after this next paragraph. I am coming back to the topic of the Seljuk Turks due to how I mentioned that they were one of the main reasons as to why the Crusades even came up in the first place. While yes, these people would have their descendants be the rulers of the Ottoman Empire and that they were Muslims, their history is not as clear-cut as to say that they were Muslim because they were born as such. These peoples were considered barbarians even by Muslims and were from Central Asia, and as they crossed over into the Middle East, and specifically Anatolia, they converted to Islam, largely for an advantageous position, as it was the majority religion in the region as aforementioned. Despite this, they even undermined other Islamic states, with one good example being the Fatimid Caliphate, having pushed their territory further into the Sinai and Egypt. which is an important detail to take note of because if we think about Komnenos' letter, this would make sense. He was not attacked by Muslims, rather he was attacked by a group of certain nomadic Central Asian peoples who were Muslim. The reason I am making this point is to show that, like the western half of the world, the East was also internally divided. To call all Muslims the same is similar to calling all Christians the same, and those statements are inaccurate. There is a concept known as dhimis, which is best summarized as a way for people of the book, that is, Christians, Jews, and other minorities or even Muslim minority sects, were allowed to live as long as they paid a tax. While this in hindsight is not a perfect way to allow the existence of the people you have conquered, it is better than to believe that they are imperfect and push the idea of otherness to the point where they are disposable. There were usually three groups that a person could fall into: dhimis, al-Dima, people of the armistice, al-Hudna, or people who received guarantee of safety, al-Aman. Known as protected people, dhimis were non-Muslims who agreed to live under Islamic rule and received permanent protection from Muslims. The people of the armistice were those who were not under Islamic rule, were not living in Islamic lands, and their only requirement was to not war against the Muslims. Finally, the people who receive a guarantee of safety are those who stay in Muslim territory temporarily and do not pay jizya, such as merchants, envoys, and traders. And while this source talks about the early Islamic caliphates, they can also be translated into many Islamic nation-states due to the fact that variations of this law were put into practice. This is not to excuse the dhimis system from a modern-day standpoint, but it is not to say that the Islamic-ruled lands were a dystopia or utopia. Basic logic also mentions how Italy was raided, and a good example of this would be the raid on Rome in 846. My only criticism of it is the fact that while yes, they were done by Arabs, these raids were conducted not by well-trained troops of any Islamic-ruled state. Rather, they were done by Saracen mercenaries who could be hired by any power at any given time. And due to the nature of mercenaries not being beholden to a nation-state entirely except money, they ransacked the outskirts of Rome and participated in slavery. It is not to say that the official Islamic states did not condone this attack. Rather, it is to say that they did not explicitly order it. And if we look through it more clearly, it seems rather like an opportunistic venture made of non-state actors who had weaponry and the equipment and utilized them for ill intentions. The wicked Saracens reached the Roman shorelines close to the city of Ostia. Disembarking, they came to that city. Its inhabitants had shut it up and fled, and captured it. Then their scouts and others of them began to wheel round and attack anything they could find. Reaching the nearby city of Porto, they found it abandoned by its inhabitants, and purloining supplies and anything they thought they needed from there, on Monday and Tuesday, they returned to Ostia. When the Romans knew of this, the plan they decided on was to send to Porto the Saxons, the Frisians, and the Scola, called that of the Franks. These got there on Monday and spent that night there on watch. Next day, Tuesday, some of these Saracens came after plunder. They were captured in flight, but escaped across a bridge. They killed 12 of them, but the rest escaped on a boat. Once the Romans realized this, they kept the most wearisome watch over the gates of the city of Rome. Of course, because of these mercenaries, the growing spite and resentment for the Muslim peoples grew. While the enslavement and the sacking of the Italian peoples by the Saracens was unjustified and only done in the hopes of profit, this would not completely absolve those individuals who participated in the Crusades of what they had done during their expeditions and time in that land. Another point to make here is the state of the Mediterranean Sea, the system of trade, and of course the slavery aspect. The Mediterranean Sea was not truly governed under the sense that there were fixed laws that everyone had to follow. In fact, many city-states and many merchants followed their own codes of conduct, with an unclear distinction between a raider or a genuine trader. Basic logic makes the statement that, as a result of the Crusades, the Mediterranean was secured. This is subjective because while they achieved their perceived goal of curbing growing Islamic influence, the constant contesting between states from both Europe and the Levant was never put down. He also briefly discusses the enslavement perpetrated by the Muslims onto the peoples of Italy. While this is true and there are many accounts of it, the way he frames it seems to disparage the other halves of the story. It is not to say that another slavery is worse than the rest. It is to say that slavery was considered to be an economy rather than a tragedy. Most, if not all, nation-states throughout the world, including the Holy Roman Empire, were using slaves to some extent or degree. It is not who does the slavery, rather it is about the act of slavery itself. Slavery did not completely disappear in medieval Europe, although it did move from the heartland of Latin Christendom to its frontiers, and from the countryside to the towns. Historians utilizing the richer archival sources of the late Middle Ages have tried to gauge the nature of the slave market and to determine its economic impact. From notarial contracts recording slave purchases, distinct cycles have emerged in the importation to the Latin Mediterranean of Muslim, Greek, Tartar, and by the 15th century, African captives. Mediterranean towns received the majority of these unwilling immigrants. The Crusades eventually primarily focused on retaking the Holy Land because they were to liberate the Christians who were underneath what they perceived to be oppression against an ever-growing enemy land, and that they were morally righteous in the sense that they used religion and generalized the Muslim lands as well as their peoples. If we are going to simplify this without making it seem black and white, the Crusaders were even further propelled by this liberating narrative and defense of Western civilization because of their behavior being condoned by a high religious order. When our actions are condoned by an authority and we are given most of the glory and credit, the human mind rarely acts accordingly with humility. Regarding the liberation of the Holy Land, to the people who lived in the Middle East, they saw the Crusaders with initial confusion. As to them, they had never done anything that would incite an act of war, and they had never conceived that the fact that they were expanding and incorporating lands and peoples on a grand scale would be perceived as hostility or belligerence. And because of this, even the Muslims were propelled by the same religious narrative of protecting their own dogma. To further drive home this point, I will briefly discuss the difference between the Crusader treatment of the Middle Eastern Jews and Christians and the Muslim treatment of the two. While the Dhimis system showed the flawed concept of allowing a conquered people to live through compensation, they were treated more fairly than the Westerners who were now coming ashore. Eastern Christians were still killed and persecuted. While rare, it was indeed done because many of them spoke Arabic and because many of them might have looked indistinguishable from other Middle Easterners to the average Germanic or Frank, and in some cases considered these Christians to be treasonous. Regarding the Jews, this was not a sudden outburst of anti-Semitism. This was a sentiment that was somewhat taken from the Roman Empire due to the failed diplomatic actions and the constant rebellion uprisings in Judea. Despite the years that dragged on and the many crusades that were ordered and condoned by not only the papacies but other key individuals, these operations would never be truly seen as a military victory. But because of their expeditions, this would give them more insight into their perception of the East as they learned about the Muslims, their culture, their trade, and most importantly, the other groups of people who lived there. The same can be said about the Muslims' perception of the Crusaders. After the first few crusades, establishing kingdoms, especially in the holy city of Jerusalem, they had achieved their goal in the short term. But after 2 centuries, these kingdoms would wither away as their territory shrunk, and after 100 years since the Crusaders stepped foot into Jerusalem, Saladin and his army took it. And it goes beyond just the East. This goes inward to the opportunistic idealism as a result of years of fighting under the story of being the instruments of God, causing them to even ransack and perpetrate the acts they themselves condemned in Constantinople. No matter the argument for justification on both sides, War is a brutal endeavor where lives are lost and no one truly wins, other than the ones who profit most off of it. The only ones who are truly tragic are those that suffer and those among them who also cause more suffering. To quote Gesta Francorum during the conquest of Jerusalem, they also ordered all the Saracen dead to be cast outside because of the great stench, since the whole city was filled with their corpses. And so the living Saracens dragged the dead before the exits of the gates and arranged them in heaps, as if they were houses. No one ever saw or heard of such slaughter of pagan people, for funeral pyres were formed from them like pyramids, and no one knows their number except God alone. But Raymond caused the emir and the others who were with him to be conducted to Ascalon, whole and unhurt. However, on the 8th day after the city was captured, they chose Godfrey as head of the city to fight the pagans and guard the Christians. On the day of St. Peter ad Vincula, they likewise chose as patriarch a certain very wise and honorable man, Arnulf by name. This city was captured by God's Christians on the 15th day of July, the 6th day of the week. Before I go on with my personal conclusions on the video critique, I must say, in contemporary times when we argue about morality or the practicality of certain subjects, in some cases we make hasty generalizations, or simply do not know the depths of the topic, looking at it through a surface-level entry. While you can make a point that, without close observation, sounds rational and logical, it can also make the world seem more black and white than it truly is. Basic logic plausibly knows that the world is complex, but the conclusion of the video that discusses a series of events in history that is required to be handled with care and consideration in 3 minutes is very simplified. My interpretations of the Crusades is not slandering because I have been using actual sources, both primary and secondary, to not claim that the Crusades were terrible and should have never been done, but to claim that any sort of zero-sum conclusion is correct would be more flawed than if it was, the Crusades were complex. The Crusades, from a Western perspective, were justified. From a larger perspective, the Crusades were an overshoot of diplomacy that focused more on religious justification in the hopes of profit or territorial gain to push an agenda for Christians, Muslims, and non-Christians, resenting each other. When I say overshoot of diplomacy, I mean in the sense that the West was unwilling to reach out to a people they had already considered to be belligerent, and in turn, the East inherited their sentiment. A cycle that remains because we are not willing to sit down with the people we dislike and have a conversation rather than an immediate act of aggression, because humans are rational, irrational creatures that will do anything so long as it completes an objective, whether it be for a need or a want. Now, here's the real critique I am making. The critique about this was not solely about the justification of the Crusades, rather the framing of Western civilization. Not all Westerners were Christian, and not all Christians were Westerners. From a contemporary period as we live in what we consider to be the modern times, Western civilization is clearly impressive because from a technological standpoint, some individuals can overstep and instead consider Western or any one civilization to be the only substantial civilization. I am not saying basic logic said that the West was the only real civilization to defend, but the rationale he is making of the Crusades is clearly centered around the region. The Egyptian standard of civilization, Mesopotamia's standard of civilization, Indus River Valley, Mesoamerica, Huanghe, Norte Chico, every civilization has a reason to defend themselves. There's a reason why civilizations have evolved into countries and continents. But to say one civilization is worth more than another does not sound like a reason or humility. In my personal opinion, that sounds like arrogance. In conclusion, the video by Basic Logic is simplified and presents a narrative of saving Western civilization as to why the Crusades were justified and therefore should not be slandered, while inadvertently or not, leaving out large amounts of context. This is not meant to say that he is completely incorrect and that all of the statements he made in the video are wrong, as that is not what this video is about. Instead, the way he presented and framed his video made the Crusades feel like a story narrative, similar to a knight-errant's journey rather than a real-life conflict. If we are to oversimplify history, we are to not make one-sided arguments or statements, as they are surefire ways to have the oversimplification to backfire, because we have the technology as well as the information to expand and to grow. Informal disclaimer: this is not what my real content will be if I continue posting. I am not a critique or a reaction kind of individual, but please know that I am not doing this on the regular. Regardless, I wish you all the best, and I wish you well. Thank you for watching.